This is Florida, and this is the exact forest we need to look at. What's so unusual about it? Trees, more trees, a couple of cabins, and then you see it, the lake. Since 1981, people have been dying in it, and not one of them had even the slightest chance of making it out alive. But let's take a closer look at the lake itself. It's pretty small, so it's not like you could just get lost out there. There are no crocodiles or other predators living in it, so nothing's going to eat you, so how can it kill people? The answer is what lies beneath the surface. Under the lake lies an entire network of flooded caves. They keep drawing people in, even though it has a reputation for being incredibly deadly. But, well, everyone has their own way of getting kicks. The most disturbing part of this story is that if you get lost inside or if anything else goes wrong, no one will be able to rescue you. And yes, this place is still open to visitors. Why? That's what we're going to find out today. So let's start with what's actually down beneath the lake. You might assume there's just a lake bed down there, but that's not the case. Eagle's Nest doesn't really have a solid bottom. You keep swimming, and then suddenly, right beneath you, a vertical passage opens up. Divers call it the chimney, and honestly, the name fits perfectly. It's basically a shaft, a narrow vertical tunnel about 6.5 feet wide. Now picture yourself in a wetsuit with tanks, lights, reels, gauges, basically carrying a whole pile of metal on your back, and then imagine having to squeeze carefully into that shaft. Comfortable? Not even close. Dangerous? Oh, absolutely. According to many divers, the tunnel is about 65 feet long. So this isn't one of those drops where you dive down and instantly reach the next level. It's a slow, careful descent through a narrow stone shaft. One wrong move and your gear starts scraping and snagging against the walls, and that's only the beginning, because at the bottom of that tunnel, there's something else waiting. You come out of the narrow chimney and suddenly a huge underground chamber opens up in front of you. Divers call it the ballroom. And again, the name is quite accurate. Many compare the size of the space to an aircraft hangar. It's an enormous water-filled cavern, so vast that your flashlight beam just vanishes into the darkness. And that's the part that really made me wonder from a geological point of view, how does something like this even form? The whole place is made of limestone, the same rock that makes up much of Florida's underground geology. Long ago, water moved slowly through these rocks. Drop by drop, it dissolved the limestone, widened the cracks, and slowly opened them up more and more. Hundreds of years passed, then thousands. And eventually, those fractures turned into giant underground chambers, like the one inside Eagle's Nest. The walls are uneven, with hollows, ledges, and folds of stone, all carved away by water over thousands of years. The rock looks almost as if it had been slowly melted and then suddenly frozen in place. It's beautiful, almost mesmerizing even. And that still isn't all. At about 130 feet down, there's a large mound of broken rock, basically a cone-shaped pile of rubble. And from that point, the cave system continues deeper into the limestone. The passages branch off in different directions and gradually descend farther down. Some lead to larger chambers, others open into entirely new rooms, and you know what? The entire cave system stretches for almost 1.25 miles, and its maximum depth goes beyond 295 feet. At the same time, every turn inside Eagle's Nest is a potential trap. Narrow tunnels, complex layout, total darkness. But divers are people who train for conditions like this. So why did Eagle's Nest become such a legend in stories about diving fatalities and underwater caves? During Christmas of 2013, Darren and his 15-year-old son Dylan arrived at Eagle's Nest to go diving. On the shore, everything looked perfectly ordinary. The tanks were checked, regulators were connected, on their wrists were dive computers tracking depth and time underwater. They had everything needed for a calm descent and a safe return. But the dive ended in tragedy. Dylan's body was found first. He was lying almost at the exit, at a depth of about 65 feet, as if he'd been trying to make it back and couldn't. Darren's body was discovered deeper at around 128 feet. Both of them had run out of air. And that raises the obvious question, if their preparation seemed normal, what could possibly have gone wrong? Investigators and rescue teams later considered several possible scenarios. One of them may have lost the route inside the tunnels. In underwater caves, that can happen faster than you might think. They might have gone deeper than planned, or perhaps something happened to Dylan himself. And here it's important to understand one thing. For a 15-year-old, dark underwater caves create an entirely different level of psychological pressure. There's no open water. A ceiling hangs above your head, walls surround you, The only way up is the same narrow tunnel you used to enter. And if someone gets disoriented even for a moment, the situation can spiral very quickly. But that leads to another question. If only adults, experienced, and psychologically stable divers entered this cave, would it make the place safer? Unfortunately, no. Eagle's Nest doesn't care how old you are. It claims both the young and the experienced. December 1981, Terry Collins and her husband Larry arrive at Eagle's Nest. One important thing to consider, they were not beginner divers. The dive started smoothly. They passed through the same narrow vertical shaft. They descend deeper. But at around 262 feet, everything begins to fall apart. Terry suddenly stops responding to her husband's signals. Larry gestures, trying to get her attention. No response. Within seconds, it becomes clear. She's lost consciousness. Larry tries to save his wife. He begins ascending, reaches the surface, and asks an experienced instructor for help. It might seem like this is where the story should take a different turn. But once again, the incident ended in tragedy. How could something like this happen to experienced divers? To understand that, you have to look at the environment. Eagle's Nest plunges deep underground for dozens of feet. At those depths, it's practically a different world. The pressure's far higher than what we experience at the surface. The usual rules of breathing begin to work differently. The human body suddenly faces physics it was never meant to handle. At such depths, divers typically use special breathing gas mixtures, but Terry was breathing ordinary compressed air. And that's where the real problem begins. The deeper you descend, the denser the air in the tank becomes. Breathing it gets harder. But the bigger issue is nitrogen. It makes up most of the air, and under pressure, it begins affecting the nervous system. Divers call this condition nitrogen narcosis. In simple terms, the brain starts behaving as if the diver were drunk. Thinking becomes harder. Reactions slow down. Coordination declines. Something like this most likely happened to Terry. After that, she lost her regulator, the device delivering air to her mouth. At that depth, losing it can turn into a life-threatening emergency almost instantly. But what about the instructor? Why couldn't he help? As soon as he heard what had happened, he descended, going deeper than 230 feet to try and rescue her. But another very human factor came into play. Sometimes even experienced people, when trying to save someone, act too quickly. Emotions override careful planning. The instructor had only a single air tank. For rescue dives at such depths, that's usually not enough. And here, there simply wasn't time for full preparation. In the end, even a diver with that much experience could not make it back to the surface. But hold on, don't people need some kind of special certification to dive into caves this dangerous? They do. And more than that, many of the people who complete that training become true experts. But as you've probably already guessed, even certified divers can get hurt or never make it back at all. Because Eagle's Nest does not care whether you have a certificate or not. In 2004, 2 cave divers died in the Eagle's Nest cave system, John Robinson and Craig Simon. These were not amateurs. They had years of experience. They were trained in both technical diving and cave diving. They used underwater scooters to move more quickly through Eagle Nest's tunnels. They breathed special helium-based gas mixes to reduce the risk of nitrogen narcosis. But even all of that wasn't enough. The divers went extremely deep into the system. They pushed beyond the usual routes and entered narrow passageways where there's no natural light at all. In those tunnels, you can't navigate without a flashlight. Turn it off for even a second, and your entire world disappears. But for experienced cave divers, that was still considered a manageable situation. They had powerful lights, guideline reels, and solid training. It seemed like everything was under control, but the real danger came from the cave itself. Silt rose up from the bottom. In cave diving, that's one of the worst things that can happen. One careless move with the scooter and visibility drops to absolute zero. One of the divers lost his bearings and swam deeper into the system when he actually needed to head for the exit. The other was trying to find his way back along the guideline, but at some point became entangled in it. And that was when the situation turned truly critical. In a cave, you can't simply swim upward to the surface. The only way out is the same way you came in. Once they ran out of breathing gas, it became clear that there was no escape. Rescuers later found Robinson's body in a narrow passage about 260 to 295 feet from the entrance. Simon's body was discovered a little farther in, hanging from the very line he'd been using to try and find his way out. And that got me thinking, maybe what's needed is even more advanced training. Maybe you could memorize every route, plan every move in detail. You get the idea. Maybe that sounds good in theory, But even making several dives into Eagle's Nest is no guarantee that you'll survive. October 5th, 2016. 2 more divers set out to explore Eagle's Nest. This wasn't their first time entering the system. They had real experience and already had made multiple dives in this exact deadly place. Before the dive, they made a simple agreement with the people waiting on the surface. They would meet back up in an hour, a standard arrangement for this kind of expedition, but an hour passed and they never returned. That was when it became clear that something had gone wrong. The search began almost immediately, but because of the cave system's depth and maze-like tunnels, they couldn't be found that same day. Only later were their bodies discovered at a depth of about 262 feet. And again, the exact cause of the tragedy remains unknown. Official sources say it may have been the loss of the guideline, poor visibility, navigation errors, or technical problems with their equipment. In a maze of underwater tunnels, any one of those can be fatal, and no amount of experience can fully protect you from that. So maybe the real question is whether this place should be closed for good. Why didn't the authorities do anything while people kept dying? The thing is, they did try. The measures just weren't very strict. In the late 1990s, officials finally stepped in. The situation had become impossible to ignore. Too many accidents, too many stories ending the exact same way. So they made a simple decision. From 1999 to 2003, diving in Eagle's Nest was officially banned. But it didn't take long for the cave diving community to push back against a total closure, and their argument sounded convincing. The problem wasn't the cave itself, the problem was the people were going in without proper training. And what do you know, in the end, the authorities accepted that reasoning and lifted the ban. So yes, it really was that simple. Officials took the divers at their word and reopened the site. But there was one catch. Some restrictions technically remained, though in practice they were mostly symbolic. At the cave entrance, they installed a sign that eventually became almost legendary. It reads, "Stop. Prevent your death. Go no farther." Next to it's another chilling line, "There is nothing in this cave worth dying for." The idea was that warnings like these would scare off unprepared divers. On top of that, officials stated that only certified cave divers were supposed to enter, but there was no checkpoint at the entrance. No one stood by the water inspecting certifications. In other words, the rule existed, but enforcing it was left entirely up to the divers themselves. And that's still the case today. Anyone who wants to go in can do so, whether they are confident, reckless, or simply eager to test their limits. And everyone's limits are different. Sometimes the body simply cannot handle it. In January 2017, 55-year-old diver Charles Odom entered Eagle's Nest with his dive partners. At first, everything went smoothly. They moved through the system, completed what they'd planned, and began their ascent. It seemed like the hardest part was already behind them. All that remained was decompression and returning to the surface. But that was exactly when everything changed. As they approached a decompression stop, Charles signaled to his partners that something was wrong. Within seconds, he began losing control of his body. But if his partners were right there, why couldn't they save him? The truth is, they tried. The divers kept his regulator in his mouth so he could continue breathing and started bringing him up slowly, but they ran into another problem. They were still in the middle of decompression. If they'd rushed to the surface too quickly, it could have killed them too. By the time they finally reached the surface, it was already too late. The 55-year-old diver had died. At first, it seemed obvious, decompression problems. That can happen in deep diving, but then another question comes up. What did his health have to do with it? When Charles's body was examined, an important detail came to light. He had serious health issues that not many people knew about. Later, doctors concluded that the combination of those conditions and the intense stress of decompression was the very trigger that led to the tragedy. But what if someone's health problems are not that severe? Could that at least be some small guarantee that Eagle's Nest won't take their life? Not at all. And another case from 2011 proved exactly that. That year, experienced cave diver Bill Bowden completed his dive successfully. He made it through the narrow passageways, carried out the plan, began his ascent, and surfaced safely. Everything looked perfect. It seemed like the story had ended well. But sometime after getting out of the water, he began showing symptoms of decompression sickness. This is a condition in which gases dissolved in the blood begin forming bubbles. Those bubbles can block blood vessels and disrupt circulation and organ function. For divers, it's one of the worst possible scenarios. Bowden was rushed to the hospital and placed in a hyperbaric chamber. There, doctors try to restore pressure in the body and force those gas bubbles to dissolve back into the blood. Sometimes that can save a person's life. But in this case, his condition was too severe. He died. Later, another important detail emerged. Bill Bowden had once undergone heart surgery that included a valve replacement. A doctor had officially cleared him to dive. Formally, there were no contraindications, but the extreme conditions inside Eagle's Nest placed too much strain on his body. And that's still not the most dangerous thing that can kill someone during a dive. What's even worse is having no equipment at all. And believe it or not, that's something people actually do here. This is called freediving, a very strange and, at the same time, deeply impressive type of diving. A person goes underwater without scuba gear, without tanks, without any air supply. At most, they have a mask, sometimes fins, and that's it. Before the dive, they take only one deep breath, and then they stay underwater the entire time on a single breath hold. When you watch trained freedivers, it almost looks unreal. Some of them can stay underwater for several minutes and descend to depths of well over dozens of feet. But even with training, dives like this are still dangerous. The deeper a person goes, the faster oxygen is used up, and loss of consciousness can happen without warning. So the question is, how could something like this happen at Eagle's Nest? In 2018, a group of young people came to Eagle's Nest. They were simply hanging out near the entrance to the cave and doing breath hold dives. The routine was simple: a quick breath, a fast descent down the shaft, and then back up to the surface. They repeated these short dives again and again, but at some point, one of the young men decided to go deeper. He took a breath, disappeared underwater, and began descending into the darkness of the cave. He never came back up. Sometime later, his body was found at a depth of about 148 feet. So what might have happened this time? Most likely it was something known as hypoxic blackout, a sudden loss of consciousness caused by a lack of oxygen. During freediving, a person holds their breath, and as they descend, the increasing water pressure compresses the air in their lungs. This can create the deceptive feeling that everything is fine, as if there's still plenty of oxygen left. But the real danger begins on the way back up. As the diver ascends, the water pressure drops quickly and the oxygen level in the blood can collapse in a matter of seconds. At that moment, the brain simply shuts down. The person loses consciousness, sometimes without even realizing anything is wrong. But at least in this case, the body was eventually found. Sometimes people simply vanish, and to this day, no one knows what happened to them. We moved to another part of Florida, to a spring called Vortex Spring. From above, it looks like an ordinary natural pool. Crystal clear water, fish drifting lazily near the surface. There are even swings nearby for tourists. But the moment you take a closer look, you realize there's something far more sinister under the surface. Beneath this seemingly harmless pool lies a flooded cave system. And yes, people have died here too. The cave was even sealed off. At about 60 feet down, a diver suddenly comes face to face with a familiar warning sign that basically says, "Prevent your death, go no farther." Although honestly, is that really much of a barrier? It was basically the same as at Eagle's Nest. Well, technically there were metal gates too, just ordinary looking bars, an arrow opening, nothing especially dramatic. But in reality, that gate marked the boundary between two completely different worlds. On one side, the relatively safe spring area where tourists swim and beginner divers practice. On the other, a real underwater cave. So if it was all closed off, how were people still disappearing in there? That's where the story gets truly strange. Experienced, certified cave divers were still allowed in. They could be given a key to the gate, show your credentials, prove your level of training, and you're allowed to enter. But in August 2010, things took a very different turn. A man named Ben McDaniel walked up to the gate. He didn't show any certifications. He didn't explain anything. He just tried to open it. One of the spring employees was watching him from the side, and at some point he apparently decided, this guy's going in no matter what. If I don't open it, he'll force his way through. So the employee simply took the key and opened the gate. That was how Ben McDaniel entered the cave. And after that, no one ever saw him again. But when someone disappears, don't people at least try to recover the body? They do. And in this case, they tried very hard. Divers and police searched the cave for days and weeks. They followed the same tunnel system Ben was believed to have entered. They examined passages, pockets, and tight passageways. They found only a few of his tanks left near the entrance, and that alone was strange. Normally those tanks are placed along the route so a diver has extra air available on the way back out. But the most incredible part was this. They found no sign of Ben's body, no sign of his gear, and no trace that he had ever passed through the cave at all. Highly experienced underwater search teams covered miles of flooded tunnels and narrow passages, checking every pocket they could find, and still came up with nothing. Could the same thing happen at Eagle's Nest? Unlike Vortex Spring, Eagle's Nest is open access. There are no gates, no checkpoint. A person can simply show up, gear up, and dive, and no one may even notice. And if something goes wrong, there's a real chance nobody will ever know that dive even happened. Maybe that's happened more than once. But honestly, the most important thing here is not even the number of victims. What matters more is understanding why this keeps happening. There is no curse. It's just an extremely complex, unforgiving cave system where even a small mistake can cost you everything. And nearly every tragedy there has one thing in common: human overconfidence and a chain of mistakes that starts with one small but dangerous thought, "I'll be fine."